So welcome to this final discussion. We've been, since February, reading Avner Bergstein's book, Bion and Meltzer's Expeditions into Unmapped Mental Life. And we're discussing chapter 8, the Ineffable. And Steve Myers is going to kick this off and give us some of his thoughts and ideas, and looking forward to that. Okay, take it away.
Right, thank you, David. This series is actually, I think, as with many others, sort of created various difficulties for me. When I read this chapter, I actually thought it was one of the better ones, but it still created a couple of things for me that I had a problem with. And they relate to religion and reality. So now this may seem a strange place to start, but there was one statement by Bergstein that encapsulated both issues that I want to share. He wrote, Bion hyphenated the word atonement, making it into at-one-ment, which is an incomplete being at one with ultimate reality. The first issue is that Bergstein seems to suggest it was Bion's idea to add the hyphenation and change the meaning of atonement to denote being at one. But there's a very long history to that practice, which I assume Bion was familiar with, because I think he went to a Christian prep school. So before looking at that history, just to set the context, Bergstein focuses on Jewish mysticism, which is, fine because he's an Israeli psychoanalyst. And I think his main argument is perhaps summed up by these two quotes, that the continuous struggle, striving to find words for the ineffable reality, is at the heart of the psychoanalytic quest. It is a dialectic interplay between mystical intuition and scientific conception. And by abundantly quoting classical poets, Bion is conveying his ineffable emotional experience. Well, my first problem is Bergstein is not only writing about Jewish mysticism, but he seems to be denying Christianity any role in tackling the problem of the ineffable. Now, the two reasons for saying this: one is because he ignores the history of atonement, which I'll come on to, but also he says, and I think it's hinted at, I may be misreading him when he says this, but a religious person believes in the word of God incorporated in scriptures and is certain that he understands it. This seems to be directed at Christian fundamentalism. Maybe I'm misinterpreting it and it's directed at Jewish fundamentalism, but Christian fundamentalism seems to be the much wider cultural problem that we have today, to which this criticism is relevant. But Christian fundamentalism is only a very recent phenomenon. It arose in the 19th century as a defensive response to things like the Enlightenment and evolutionary theory and the rise of science. And there are older Christian traditions and some other contemporary Christian traditions that take a different view. And we don't have to go back as far as Gnosticism or orthodoxy. We can see it in the history of the word atonement, to which I suspect Bion was alluding. Now, this is an extract from the Oxford English Dictionary definition of atone, this one's available online. So atone, short for the phrase set or make at one, assisted by the prior existence of the verb to one, which is equal to make one, put at one, or unite. Whence one was already used by Wycliffe. This is set at one.
Your sound is very wonky.
Ooh. Right, am I back? Am I back now?
You are now, yeah.
Yeah, it just flashed up briefly for a moment saying the internet was unstable. So the definition continues, that saying that the at-one-ment began to take the place of one-ment early in the 16th century, and at one to supplant the verb one about 1550. And then he makes a comment about the different forms of the verb, that at one was not admitted into the Bible in 1611, but at one was already in. It had been in since Tyndale, whose translations were about 100 years earlier. So there are actually 600 years of Christian history to the idea of at one that Bergstein attributes to Bion. So what's the relevance of this? I don't question that the word atonement represents an aspect of Jewish mystical tradition, but it also represents a part of the Christian tradition that is often overlooked, and I suspect Bion knew about. So there's a potential for a discussion here about how the Jewish mystical tradition and the pre-fundamental or contemporary liberal Christian traditions deal with the dialect between, as Bergstein puts it, mystical intuition and scientific conception. The debate is reflected in some words that psychoanalysis and analytical psychology share, but mean different things. So, for example, for Freud, psychic reality was an inner reality that's pitted against outer material reality. But for Jung, psychic reality is all reality that is constructed through the interaction of the inner and outer. Also, for Bergstein, transformation seems to be from O to K, but for Jung, transformation is of the whole personality, of both inner and outer. Or if I were to combine the two and use Bion's terminology, O and K are both transformed through their integration. So this leads into the second problem that is illustrated by the statement I highlighted at the start, that Bergstein seems to draw an invisible line, and on one side is an emotional experience which he describes as truth and reality, and he relates it to Kantian noumena. The other side is the realm of language, and he describes that as material and falsity, and he relates it to Kantian phenomena. And what I'm objecting to is the way that Bergstein is drawing that line. I'm not suggesting there aren't two different things there, but the way he draws the line and the properties that he gives to the two sides. So, for example, Bergstein writes that any utterance is just a pale shadow of the thing in itself. That is, the thing in itself is a pure form, and the expression is just a transformation of that thing. Now, I've got two problems with that, because firstly, this portrayal of phenomena and noumena as having, in effect, a one-to-one correspondence is a very common sort of misreading of Kant. Let me put another slide up. Sorry, just highlighting the differences. This portrayal is a very common reading of Kant, but the late philosopher Roger Scruton said it's a misreading of Kant, and there isn't such a correspondence. And his argument makes more sense to me. He argues that Kant was referring to two domains, a bit like being inside a room where you can see things, and there being things outside the room that are hidden, and the walls themselves are the negative borderline concepts. So that makes more sense to me for various reasons. And there isn't a one-to-one correspondence between things in the room and things outside the room. The second problem I have with Bergstein's portrayal is this stark split between the truth on the one hand and falsity on the other, or reality versus unreality. I mean, to my mind, there are two different kinds of reality, and I've no idea what Bion said about the realities of O and K. So I hunted around and actually found a film of Bion talking about our attempts to articulate the ineffable. And I actually liked this film and thought it gave a different spin on it to Bergstein. So I'm going to show you edited highlights from that film, which lasts about 8 minutes. When it's finished, I'll briefly describe my reaction to it, and then we can talk about it. As I say, it seems to me that Bion puts a different patina over the subject than Bergstein. Now, in this film, the visuals are very poor quality, but the sound is fine. Also, he has very long pauses mid-sentence, so I've just cut those out. I'm going to share this because it's going to take me a minute just to find the file, because has that appeared on your screen? There should be a black.
There's a black box.
There we go.
Continue to be people who think they have had an experience which they would like to communicate. Melanie Klein was one of them, Abraham was another, Steckel, Jung. Suppose one thought that music might be a way of exploring. It occurs to me as one of them because this is one human activity which plays a great part. Philosophy is another great activity. Mathematics is another one. I had occasion to talk to some rather distressed parents and a very distressed analyst because the child in question could not learn mathematics. Other people have difficulty learning how to play the piano. It wasn't very long after this that this same person began to feel rather pleased that they had learnt the piano because they got a certain pleasure out of the musical sounds that they were able to make. So there was some kind of expansion going on in their soul, mind, character, personality, some sort of development which was taking place, which meant that this curious facility for playing the piano was conveying something to them which had now begun to have a meaning. It's something like that that I feel about psychoanalysis and characters and personalities, even groups of people. It is useful to be able to shut off one's awareness of what's going on, so as to get the turmoil cut down enough for some relevant fact to be able to get through. Something which one could call evidence on which one might be able to base one's judgment. I think it is fairly easy to see that it's likely that the patient knows what he thinks, knows what he feels, and knows what it feels like to have a particular feeling. I've now been convinced that that is simply an approximation, an attempt to verbalize something which has not been verbalized yet, because that patient is suffering from pain. If the person in question was a painter, then they can employ various shades of color which are much more subtle. In fact, what they're doing there is really exploiting light. And that comes very near to becoming something which can be scientifically expressed in angstrom units and so forth. We're not so lucky to have anything so precise. One has to put up with words like anxious, or terrible, or frightened. And I'm lucky enough to have a chance to observe this person who is not me. Now, the communication, whether it's what I can see or whether it is what I can hear, presents me with what I now think of as mental debris. Debris that I'm talking about can have or can be a very considerable collection, that I think that one has to observe all of it. Just on the offhand, that somewhere amongst all this debris, there's a scrap of information which is important. Doing this sort of work fairly continuously and for a long time, perhaps one gets a bit more sensitive to these bits of debris which are significant. To sum up, I think that one is presented with the debris, with the vestiges of what was a patient once and what still could be sifted in such a way which is analogous to blowing up the dying embers of a fire, so some spark communicates itself to others and you build up the fire again, although it appears to be nothing but dead ash. Can one look at all this debris and detect in it some little spark still of life, which would then be fostered or developed in a way which could lead to rejuvenation, as we call it, of the whole personality? I think that something similar can be done with a group of people. It's very curious that if you take long intervals, that there seem to be certain curiously reminiscent features. For example, why does Newton engage on what I gather is a mathematical activity and start talking about light? And why does he similarly seem to encroach on what would appear to be a theological investigation? Why does Descartes similarly find himself defending a theological position? The explanation that he gives of it is quite simple. He does not like what has happened to Galileo, and he doesn't want to get into the same difficulty. But his argument is not at all a good defense of that statement. In fact, it isn't a defense of it at all. It's quite clear that he is not, in fact, intimidated by what has happened to Galileo. Over and again, you get this curious business of an inquiry, of an investigation, and then the link up with what appears to be theological theories or ideas. Nowadays, unfortunately, the collection of debris is very much increased by the debris of psychoanalysis. Somewhere hidden amongst all this debris, you can get a glimpse of actual suffering. So one has to beware of thinking that one is really hearing about the real thing, when what you're really hearing is the remnants of psychoanalysis. Therefore, you have to go through it all. Whatever you're feeling like, on the off chance that buried in this stuff there is somewhere something that matters.
Okay, so to my reading, the picture I get from Bion is very different, and for me more credible than the picture I get from Bergstein. Bion doesn't seem to be saying that language is false, at least not in this video. But if we are trying to understand the ineffable or the emotional experience, it can be debris that hides or misleads us. Debris isn't unreal, it's just a different kind of reality. And within that debris, there can be things that point to the emotional experience. I think the bottom line for me is I like the way Bion talked about this invisible divide in the film. It was credible and rational, but I didn't like the way Bernstein talked about it in the book, because his description seemed, perhaps erring more towards the mythopoesis side rather than the rational side, although it was pretending to be a rational portrayal. So in summary, my points are that Bergstein seems to credit Bion with reinterpreting the word atonement as atonement, when the English word has had that meaning for at least 6 centuries in Christianity. I may be misinterpreting him, but Bergstein seems to disregard the role of Christianity in this debate in influencing Bion's thought, and thereby discounting a potential valuable contribution that could be made to the debate. The different contribution can be seen in the different perspective offered by Jung in his different use of the terms psychic reality, transformation, and his discussion of the transcendent function. Bergstein uses a common interpretation of Kant, which I think is problematic because it's dualistic. Bergstein accentuates that dualism by affording one side the qualities of being real and true, and the other side the qualities of being unreal and false. And as I've just said, Bergstein's writings seem to sort of tend more towards the mytho-poetic side in comparison with Bion, who seems more rational. So there you are. That's it. That's those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Steve.
Yes, Steve, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Let's see, where do we start the discussion here, though? Is the ineffable that which cannot be accessed? Is it that which cannot be labeled? Is it an unconscious experience? But how do we describe it? Is it emotional only? What is mysticism in this sense? These are kind of the bigger questions for me. Are we talking about the notion of the numinous? Or are we just talking about an epistemology that's more like David's work on apophantic knowledge? So anyway, that's kind of my reaction.
I felt really impatient reading this because there is so much written about the ineffable or the unknown and unknowable and all that. He just calls on a very narrow sliver of things. And I guess at the end, I thought, well, he is an unreconstructed Kleinian, really, because the idea that the ineffable is fundamentally emotional, I thought is, that doesn't really hold water. It is, but he does stick with that assiduously throughout, that the ineffable is basically emotional experience. And I just think that, there's so much more to what you might call ineffable. Also, his notion of mysticism is very limited. I mean, there's so many kinds of mysticism, and he hasn't really made use of some of the basic texts on mysticism. And finally, just one grumpy thing is about I do think that when Bion says the analyst must become O, a lot of people read that as a kind of the analyst must go into a trance of some kind. I think that's a misreading. So I think it's basically an epistemological thing. It's like relinquishing knowledge. It's not about going into a trance. But he did seem to, I wondered whether he was going to, toward the end, imply that somehow the analyst needs to initiate the patient into a particular form of trance, or, I would see that what Bion's talking about is really, that's a business for the analyst. It's not something you should kind of inculcate in your patients. So you're not really a meditation teacher or something like that. But I'm glad he was writing about it, but I did feel that it was not very developed from my point of view.
Just an ancillary comment. there's a book by the late Dan Merker, who published a book in one of my book series called Explorations of the Psychoanalytic Mystics. And he, as I recall, he explores Bion and Mike Eigen, Grotstein, and I believe Otto Rank. It's for those who are might be interested. It's quite a scholarly book. And Merker, I don't know if you know of his work, but he was a religious scholar, religious studies guy, PhD, and then he became a psychoanalyst later in his life, and so he brought, a very weighty background to this subject matter, and he also wrote a book on mysticism, where he believed, or he wanted to advance some notion that we all engage in some kind of mystical experiences that are based upon unitive thinking. And I don't think he actually makes a very good case for why, just because we think to integrate things means that we're all mystical. But nevertheless, that seems to be some element to it. So the notion of unitive thinking, the notion, I mean, like even now in there's a big movement in that, in philosophy of mind, that is returning to the notion of pantheism, and that the whole universe is conscious, and that this makes sense, or this at least allows an explanation for the hard problem of neuroscience, explaining how we have consciousness. So we can't just boil it all down to a brain or physical substrates. And when you start thinking in those terms, that the universe could ponder itself, that to me is more of an interesting mystical idea to explore than just something that's not known or knowable. Anyway, I'll stop blabbing.
Yeah, I think I'll just say something. Yeah, I think for me, I just feel there's like a mismatch really, or there's some kind of mismatch really between the idea of trying to understand something that's hasn't been represented, and then seeing that in terms of mysticism. And then when you listen to Bion, it doesn't come across at all of that kind of trying to find some kind of select effect within among all the debris. It doesn't, mysticism doesn't really seem to, it doesn't, well, I suppose I'm trying to connect the two really. I suppose maybe it's connected for Bion maybe with reverie.
I was having a discussion earlier today with a guy about initiation and individuation. And he said he had found a sentence where Jung said they're not the same thing. And I on that point, I would agree with Jung that individuation is quite different from initiation. And it sounds to me that in this chapter, he's thinking of mysticism as a sort of initiation into this kind of emotional realm somehow. Contact with this profound emotional realm. But that to me doesn't begin to cover what individuation is. And I suppose it'd be on, you know, when he says going from O to K, to me that's always seemed like a very kind of singular, you know, just picking out something that can be said. It's not it's not necessarily an expansive thing. It's a very particular, specific thing that can be said just in that moment in the session, and it can't be generalized. So I hear Bion talking more about individuating the elements of the session rather than expanding into some emotional or affective dimension.
Can I ask a question, just sort of very basic question? When you look at the context of the book, and this being the final chapter in the book, what do you see Bergstein is trying to do? Is he talking about psychotherapy? Is he just sort of completely exploding the topic at the end, and sort of just touching on lots of different things? Because the role between mysticism and psychotherapy, I don't understand at all. Apart from the fact that you know, Jung said that when in the second half of life, then very often it's a sort of a religious task. So, I mean, from your points of view, is this chapter about psychotherapy, or is he trying to widen it out to a broader set of issues?
I think he's trying to talk about something that lots of therapists are trying to talk about, but not very skillfully. And the trainings don't really provide people with the tools to think about these things. So I think he is talking about psychotherapy, but I mean, it is a bit, this chapter does kind of take leave of previous chapters in a way. Because in the previous chapters, he did have like some clinical material, and he was trying to stay quite close to some kind of object relations framework. But here that seems gone.
Yeah, maybe you could say that maybe he's kind of, it's like a parallel to Bion, really, not like going from K to O. So maybe he's trying to like grapple with that, really. What does that actually mean, really, no? But you see, there's like a lift off here, really, no?
Well, to my mind, the fact that he sticks with the unrepresentable is emotional, then he's trapped, really. He can't go into all the aspects of things that are there. I mean, there's the unrepresented is not just emotional. It's all kinds of stuff.
What other kind of stuff? I mean, if you think of the life of an individual, so some experiences happened which they can't process.
So that could be an emotional experience. It could be a mental experience. It could be social experience.
But I mean,
it could be a soul experience.
Yeah.
So I mean, to tie it all down to digested emotional experience seems to me to be, that's a trap for him.
Yeah, but can you not say, I mean, but it's different layers, but it's had some kind of impact. It's had some impact on the individual. So does that makes it in essence some kind of emotional or not?
Yeah, I would agree with Ray there that if for anything to be meaningful, it'd have to have a felt experience on you as a subject. So there would, but to boil it all down to an emotional nucleus, I mean, like, where's the archetypal in that? I mean, there's all kinds of aspects that are extra linguistic, even, embodied somatic reactions, conceptual, symbolic, not just emotions. But whatever the case may be, when we do approximate some kind of meaningful inner experience, which would always be in the context of our world, our social world, that it reverberates in us in different ways and on different levels. And I think the real question about this has to do with the question of spirituality. And it was interesting that in Bion's talk there, that he's just locating some notion of life somewhere in the debris, and that was enough. I mean, and recall Aristotle on the soul, that something that animates us. Is that the point of looking for the ineffable? Is the point sitting with it? Is it, trying to articulate it and give it a value? I mean, I'm sure all that stuff happens, but as Steve was in that fine lecture you gave, Steve, it's funny that what came to my mind was that my first analyst trained with Bion, and my last analyst trained with Winnicott. And in my 10 years of treatment, collectively, the issue of religion and spirituality never came up in the context of therapy. And so it's like, yet it's such an important thing to us. I would assume that, particularly when you get to our ages, these things matter more and more. And then it made me also think about in my career as a clinician, how I would not introduce the topic unless it was something that the patient brought into the session. Yeah. And I wondered if Bion worked differently.
I mean, my perspective is that whatever Bion has to say is addressed to the analyst. I mean, I'm a great believer in just leaving the patient in peace, They've got enough things to worry about. But, what is the job of the analyst? So I think, Bion saying, well, the job of the analyst is to become O. I mean, I think that's a fantastic statement. And that's enough, of a job description to be getting on with. Yeah, I don't like, yeah, so if the client or patient doesn't go into an area, that's fine. It doesn't really matter. because the analyst still has their job to do.
David, can I ask you, what can you say a bit more about becoming O? What does that mean for you, for the analyst to become O? Can you say a bit more about that?
I don't know. Well, I think it's related to becoming lost and not knowing what's going on and not trying to formulate something or cling to some formulation. And then often something just comes to mind, and it might be related to what the person's saying, or it might not be. But even if you then say it, it often does have a connection with the person. But I think, you know, the K is almost always some fairly, in a way, almost trivial thing. You know, it's just like a little observation. It's not a revelation necessarily. Because, you know, he talks about the O of the session. So every, you know, it's like how to, you know, is there some word that speaks to the moment or captures the moment in some way? And it doesn't have to be dramatic. It's like in the desert fathers, you know, people would go to the desert father and they'd say, "Father, give me a word." In other words, say something that is kind of to the point.
David, can I don't know if this is going to help Raymond as well, but Ray as well, but can I tell you how I tend to see the relationship between K and O and the problem with it? And I'm pretty sure this is wrong and it's different, but if I explain it to you, then perhaps you could my view to you could perhaps tell me where I'm going wrong, and that would help see, because I can't help but look at K and O through the lens of the ego self axis, and there being some kind of correspondence there, and so O being, you know, more akin to the archetype of the self, and K being more akin, I mean, not equivalent, but being more akin to the ego. And the problem with focusing on O is, I mean, obviously for Jung, there needs to be a balance between the two. It's the ego self axis and getting the balance. And when the ego dominates, you get problems. When the self dominates, you get a different set of problems. And it's all about getting a balance between the two. And in Robert Siegel's analysis of Jung and Gnosticism, he says that Jung actually sort of, my words, not his, but shoots himself in the foot, because he promotes Gnosticism as being an exemplar of individuation, but that's not what Gnosticism does. Gnosticism is about sinking back into the unconscious. Gnosticism is about, in Bion terms, about becoming O. In Jungian terms, it's about the ego submitting to the self, and the self therefore becoming dominant. So I can't help look at it through that lens and think that actually what's needed is for there to be some kind of a balance and relationship between K and O. And in Jungian terms, that would be the transcendent function, because I think there was a question right at the start that John asked, something like, what is it that we're dealing with here? And I think in some ways Bergstein is scrabbling around looking for something, and maybe Jung's transcendent function actually provides an answer to that, except that it wouldn't satisfy Bergstein, because he is valorizing this one side of the divide, the O side, so much. Now, I think in collapsing those two things together, I'm sure I've made lots and lots of errors there, and they aren't equivalent. I can see that. What's your view?
They're not errors, they're just your point of view, which might or might not be wrong. But I mean, I wouldn't equate O with the self and K with the ego or anything like that. I mean, Jung says, when somebody tells me a dream, I remind myself that I have no idea what this dream means. So that's like, Jung just realizes that he doesn't know what's going on. And if he takes that as his starting point, then something might happen. But he also says, the greatest sin is for the analyst to know beforehand. So for the analyst to have some idea of some framework or structure that things are meant to fit into. So, I take him at his word when he says, when somebody tells me a dream, I remind myself I have no idea what this is. So I guess that to me is like a bit like getting lost, being lost, and waiting for something to appear. And often something does appear and it's pertinent in some way. So you could, I suppose, think of that as the transcendent function, but only in some kind of meta-intellectual level, not in a kind of, not in the moment, really. So, I do think the notion of the transcendent function is fantastic, but it's something I think you see in retrospect. It's not something you can aim at. The transcendent function can only come out of ignorance in order to be genuine. This is all related also to dreams, isn't it? That somewhere Jung says that, a dream is convincing because you have no idea where it's coming from. In other words, if you go start a form of meditation and you're visualizing this and visualizing that, and you sort of have a feeling of how it's going to go, well, that's not a dream. A dream comes from the unconscious, from the unknown. And I think the transference comes from the unknown, and the words of a client come from the unknown. So to me, that Jung and Bion are very close in the sense of advising the therapist to stick with that, not get too far from it.
Yeah, Steve, maybe I just respond, what I thought actually when you spoke there, I thought, came to mind what Bion talked about, the contact barrier. There was a quote of his, he talked about, I can't remember exactly, but in sense of being in both worlds, in a sense, no? So he talked about, talking to a friend where they're getting lost in fantasy, but at the same time, not to misstate of talking to a friend, but in a sense, and like being disconnected from the fantasy, yeah. So I kind of I kind of resonates with me, like is it being in both worlds at the being in both worlds at the same time.
And that was the connection that I was thinking with Christianity, because the image of the cross is that it reconciles two opposites, but it also reconciles the conscious and the unconscious. So the image of the cross is actually in both worlds at the same time, and at the same time it's actually reconciling opposites as well. Although Jung did say that the transcendent function isn't mystical, nothing mysterious or mystical about it.
But the cross is a symbol. I mean, it's a symbol precisely because we can't think about it, right?
Yeah.
So we can say, well, it's about the intersection of worlds or whatever, or the divine and the human, but we can't actually have any comprehension of that. The only comprehension we have is through some symbol. So
But I mean, maybe I missed the point, but in a sense, but the symbol, in a sense, it's talking, it's symbolizing something that we can't explain, in a sense. So in a sense, it's a symbol trying to symbolize that experience of being in both worlds. Maybe I'm missing, kind of, you know.
No,
Jung
think
says a symbol is the best possible representation of something that we can't understand.
And I think there is a connection with Bion's video, because that film of Bion, because certainly in Psychological Types he talks about the meaning of the symbol unfolding, and you know, so that actually when it's a symbol, it is. I mean, there is a part of it that's definite because we can articulate the image. What we necessarily can't articulate is the unconscious meaning that it holds. So there are the two sides to it, but the meaning of the symbol does unfold, and it brings with it a new psychological function, a new attitude. So it's not a static process. It's an ongoing process, and I think there is some connection there with Bion in the film when he was talking about mathematics or piano playing or whatever, about something emerging from amongst the debris, that it's not a static process, but it's something that is developmental, and what may be hidden one day might actually be revealed the next day. Can come to light, not necessarily always as simply as that, but it's an ongoing process of renewal, transformation.
I'd prefer to say a symbol is alive rather than developmental. If you impute some developmental process, you've already given it an agenda. But to me, the symbol is alive, and that means it has its own intentions.
Well, that sounds quite mystical, David.
Does it?
Well, yeah. How could an object have intentionality? I suppose just like the thought that the cosmos ponders itself.
Jung says that they're autonomous. The unconscious has autonomy, so it approaches us or it withdraws from us. It's not just a question of these unconscious contents are kind of tied to us or something like that. So to me, that means they're alive. So
okay, I got it.
But that's sort of what Bion's on about. What is alive? What can we find something that's alive?
I wonder what other therapists would think of this kind of discussion. Like, I'm going to be on a workshop, a 3-day workshop on psychotherapy integration next April, and I would imagine a CBT therapist would be saying something like, "I have no clue what you guys do. It sounds like you're just sitting around with your thumb up your ass." So, how do you explain this kind of work to people. So I'm sure I'll have I have a lot of questions like that thrown my way.
I just reread, Freud, the history of the psychoanalytic movement for a seminar at Essex. And, he says in there that Adler, you can discuss something with Adler because he has arguments and he's making points. But he says with Jung, you just don't know what Jung's talking about. So you don't know what to say to him. It's just like, for him, Jung is like out to lunch in a way. I don't think it's, I think people make it more complicated than it is.
John, actually, I've got a question for you. Is it, do you think, you said like during all the time in therapy that there was no mention of spirituality. Do you think, would that have made any difference, do you think, if that had been brought up? Would that have changed much, do you think? Or, I mean, just any ideas in it?
Yeah, I think it was because of the time in my life that it wasn't on my mind, and or it wasn't a pressing issue that I would be, spending my money discussing. It would be it was only later when I had a turn to Jung that this became a preoccupation, and still is. But I am also thinking that, yes, that it almost seems like that not dealing with the notion of spiritus and not dealing with the notion of ethics in one's personal life would mean an incomplete treatment. And so clearly I failed myself in that sense. I think the point though was that, and then this is probably just what an analytic stance takes, is that it takes a descriptive approach to not a prescriptive one to the patient. And so whatever we bring up in our own therapies, it comes from us, and not to be superimposed by an external method, like let's say CBT or transactional analysis in Steve's examples. Yes, and who knows, I might even go back into treatment, right? Because of that. But my own path is taking me where I need to go right now.
I don't recall there being any spiritual quest in transactional analysis. That won't surprise you. Actually, in a sense, it was a bit like CBT, because it was a very pragmatic therapy focused on particular problems, rather than sort of being a more sort of religious or developmental quest.
But I guess that maybe the problems were different. The focus of you could say in psychoanalysis, the problem is what to say, how to speak.
Mm-hmm.
That you're sitting there and it's silent, and what am I going to say here?
Yeah.
Another thing about the profession of psychoanalysis is that very, very few people are talking about the ineffable or the mystical or the spiritual. And when they do, at least my limited experience has been that people don't, meaning analysts, really don't know very much unless they've gone through this themselves. And not to mention that it can be just dismissed as, either an illusion or a delusion, even. And it's risky, I think, to bring these things up in the presence of the unknown other.
Can I
Actually-
ask one final quick question? Because I think, David, you want to have some time at the end to just sort of do a review, didn't you? But the question is, what were your thoughts on, to me, there was this, the way that Bergstein presented this divide was very, very stark. It was like everything was on one side and everything else was on the other side. And I just didn't like, and the way that he was portraying the two sides didn't seem right as well. Is those of you who are more familiar with Bion's work, does Bion portray the difference between O and K in such stark terms, or is it much more fuzzy in the way he portrays it?
Well, to me, it makes sense because, he's saying it's not so much O and K, but he's saying there's K is to do with cause and effect. So when he says without memory or desire, he's saying a state of mind that isn't focused on cause and effect. So the vast portion of our life is to do with cause and effect, but he's saying then there's the psychic, which is not to do with cause and effect and can only be known intuitively. So the reason for the lack, because memory is like thinking, well, what happened yesterday is going to cause something today, and desire is what's happening today is going to cause something in the future. So he's saying all this causal thinking is beside the point for an analyst. So that's why he focuses on intuition, that it's a way of accessing what he calls the psychic rather than cause and effect. So O is a way of accessing the psychic rather than, messing about with cause and effect. And he doesn't say it, but I would, think that the thing that goes from O to K is what Winnicott calls a spontaneous gesture. It's just some little thing that appears.
But I would also think that it would have to be unconsciously overdetermined, hence cause. So no matter what, we can't escape the fact that these things are happening, even if we're in a state of mind that is suspending or attempting to suspend memory and desire. Of course, we can never do that. That's not, I don't think, the point that Bion's trying to make, but you could never enter into an experience without memory and desire. I mean, that's just part of who we are. But a certain type, for instance, maybe putting aside expectations, it's like Freud's, evenly hovering attention is not to place a value on one thing over the other, but just see what emerges, as you put it, autonomously. And then that has value, that has some significance. That might be what is more important here in that moment. And the notion of O is the unknowable part of that session, let's say, when he talks about it that way. Once again,
I think for myself, I thought when he said that the language is false, I was surprised by that, actually, to say, like, because I mean, I think where I see it actually is the idea of that's with some kind of context. So in the sense of like a word or something, it might make a connection with the unknown, really, you know. So I think that, you know, and I don't think Bion would have said that words are false. That one just my own. Or they aren't necessarily false. No?
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Well, he has the idea of publication, doesn't he? That so he talks about lies, but he also talks about publication. In other words, making something public or speaking or asserting something. So moving it from the private world to the public world. So that's sort of what language does. So he's not, he's saying that's complicated, but he's not saying it's pointless.
It's interesting to observe how this group has dwindled, and I just can't help but think that a lot of people just did not like this book, and they didn't want to hang in to the end. But maybe I'm wrong about that.
Well, clearly there was a lot of animus toward the book from the very beginning.
So, David, can I ask, why did you choose? How did you come about choosing this book in the first place?
I thought it had an interesting title and interesting chapters. I hadn't read it myself. I guess I think reading a book is like an excuse to get together and talk. I mean, earlier in the year, I did a group with The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, but that was a closed group. So, you know, people joined at the beginning and then nobody else joined. And that, well, I think, I don't know, the fact that it was a closed group, I think made it different. And probably also the nature of the book made it different too. So I think having a kind of open group on Zoom at such infrequent intervals was difficult. I mean, when I started this whole thing, we were all meeting in person. So I imagined we'd meet in person and sit around a table and, you know, chew these things over. But that's not how it's evolved. So I think, you know, I'm inclined that if I do a book again, it would be a closed group. And, but I think the psyche thing, I see how that goes, because that's a sort of theme over the year, different input. But I guess it's a bit tricky trying to think about how to undertake a project like this with on Zoom, really. You know, how I know there's some Zoom groups that are going great guns. But maybe I don't know. Well, like Steve said at the beginning, I'm not sure whether it's me. Is it me or is it the book or is it? But I think Steve from New York said that, you know, up in Boston, there are groups discussing Bergstein's books and they're very animated by them. I'm not sure we've been very animated by it.
I thought we'd been quite animated, but perhaps not, not in an entirely constructive way.
I like the venue is that it's about comparison, and that means critique, and that means criticism, and that means controversial discussions, and that means we don't have to all agree, and we don't have to like each other either. If we do like each other, that's a benefit. But debating things is interesting, and sometimes I've been able to running in different circles, meaning different psychoanalytic circles, make some comparisons. So, for instance, there's an overwhelming Jungian influence to this group that you don't see in, let's say, New York East Coast circles. You don't. It seems like people are too inbred that they only want to gravitate towards certain ideas. They want to mirror one another. They want to ingratiate themselves and congratulate their friends and stay really enclosed. And any outside encroachment or question even is seen as a taboo thing. And I suppose that mirrors the history of psychoanalysis in many ways. But I think that Jungians are more open to all kinds of other ideas that are often, occluded in other in-groups. And that's just my experience. And it's not trying to generalize to everybody, but yeah, anyway.
I think that's true, that generally as a culture, the Jungian culture is more open. But I mean, discussing things comparatively is very, very difficult, because people, if you're steeped in one school of thought and you're aware of all the minutiae and debates and so on, to then talk with somebody else who's in a different pot, it's very hard to arrive at, what level are we talking about here, and how detailed is this, and how, I suppose that's one advantage of having like a closed discussion, is you get to get the measure of different people in a way, and develop a language to talk. But I think that generally the project of being comparative is very slow to develop and slow to find a way forward.
And then can I ask, why is to find like a comparative approach, why is that important for you?
Well, I think it's important because that's how you learn. I mean, what Jung says, is my method of dream interpretation is finding the context. So you learn what this is by finding out what this is, right? So that's the way I learn, is I learn about something by looking at something else and seeing how they compare and contrast and so on. So it's just, that's how I learn. But I do think in terms of the profession, a lot of people are tired of being in their silo and want to speak to others, but it's hard to know how to do that. How do you go about it? If you were kind of raised and analyzed and trained in this group, how do you speak then to this group? It's very complicated. It's very tentative. So I think, you know, partly it's just me, how I learn and how I prefer to learn, but also I do think there is a kind of curiosity about the others in psychoanalysis. You know, I mean, I think some people in the department have been sort of curious about, well, what do these Jungians think about that anyway? Or curious about, you know, what does Bion say? Because they had no Bion in their training. So, but to go from being sort of vaguely curious to having a proper conversation is a bit of a leap.
David, can I share the other video clip that I had from Bion and just my other Bion experience?
Yeah.
That just to briefly explain, I used to do team development amongst other things for a while, and I used Bion's experiences in groups, but not in the way that you would think, because in the book, he's got these. The way the book's structured is that he reports on some research at a military hospital first of all, and then he goes on and does some psychiatric research, in which he abandons all the principles that he discovered as a criteria for a successful group, and he identifies two levels of group functioning: work groups and basic assumption groups. But actually, later on in the book, when he you know, sort of going on about basic assumption groups, he says that if you can get the work group right, it's more powerful than the basic assumption group. And the success criteria, he didn't actually use the word success, but I think he talked about things like good team spirit and so on. There were things like, you know, common purpose, clear group boundaries in relation to other groups, the capacity to absorb and lose members, although perhaps at the moment we're focusing on losing members, freedom from rigid subgroups, following each individual member, and the capacity to face disconsent. And I actually used these in my work. So when I went in, I didn't go in and immediately start at the psychological level. I went in and started with common purpose. And it was very often transformational. You know, just some of the things that would happen by getting a team to work together to work out a common purpose. But when I was looking at this video I shared before, I found this is more for comedy element rather than serious, although it does make a serious point at the end. But I found Bion talking about comparative psychoanalysis as well. So I'll just try and share that as well, if I can. And I've lost the screen again, so it just appears in various different places.
It is there.
Yes.
Oh, right, okay, yeah. It's there, but it's behind it. It only lasts a minute.
I get so sick and tired of hearing about the various different schools of psychoanalysis and their great superiority to the other one, whichever it is. One of the reasons for this is because the possibility of arguing about the relative merits is simply endless. As long as you don't anchor any of it to facts, you can continue endlessly. But the other point about it is, I don't think I know of any scientific work unless it is based on observation. It's a great comfort in any case, because if you can base it on observation, then you have something to go on, which is as near to facts as you're ever likely to get in this extraordinary subject.
So I just thought, nice little clip beyond talking about comparative psychoanalysis.
Yeah, sick and tired.
Yeah, so what are we observing here? What have we observed? Are they facts or not facts? Don't know.
can we observe the ineffable?
Yeah, and then I just had a thought. Then, but when you talk about fact, I mean, is that always is that always related to your kind of subjectivity? Yeah, or is it, or are we talking about a fact which is kind of it's different from your subjectivity? No.
Actually, that connects back to the Bergstein chapter on Jewish mysticism, because William James has a chapter on mysticism in Varieties of Religious Experience, and he says, he says it's of great value and can bring a truth, but the truth is only for the person who has the mystical experience, and it's not valid for other people. So this question about are they subjective facts or what is, I mean, it's a big question, but I think there's a connection there with mysticism as well, and I think the danger with some mystical approaches is it's taken as that subjective experience is taken as an experience that must be applied to everybody.
What Jung says, a dream has a meaning only for the two people in the room. So that would really, puncture the balloons of people who want to build big cosmic meaning structures. And I think, to me, that also relates to, Bion's O to K. It is a meaning that is only meaningful in that moment.
It's a shame Stephen hasn't been here today, because there was something he said at the last session that, do you remember him saying that in the 1960s, something happened to Bion and he changed. And I think Stephen actually said, some people thought he went mad. So it would be interesting to know what his thought was on that video, because that video was from the 1970s. But I liked a lot of what Bion said in that. I mean, the whole video lasts about an hour, and I liked a lot of what Bion said in that video, whereas Bergstein's stuff doesn't make so much sense to me. But as I say, I'm not a psychotherapist, so one has to take that into account. But Bion's wanting things to be grounded in fact is something that certainly appeals to me, that you have the two sides. You have intuition, but you need some grounding as well. And you get this dialogue taking place, or this dialectic taking place between the two. Bergstein seemed to acknowledge that there was such a dialectic, but then he sort of seemed to come down very heavily on the one side.
What's the name of that video by Bion?
It's a Tavistock lecture, I think in 1976 or something. It's on YouTube. I think if you do a search on Bion Tavistock YouTube, I think that you'll find it that way.
Okay.
But be prepared for. I'm impressed at his skill to be able to start a sentence, then have a long gap, and then continue the sentence as if there were no gap. So his intonation at the end of that gap is exactly the same as when he started the break. So there were, I mean, that 8-minute clip was probably on the film about 15 minutes, I would say, with all the gaps. So I just went through chopping them out.
Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you, guys, for there.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Dave and John. Okay, thank you.
So hopefully see you soon. Okay.
Yeah, it was enjoyable.
Yeah.
Bye
Yeah.
for now.
Okay, take care. Okay, all the best.
Thank you. Right, see you again. Bye.
Okay, bye. Bye.